Hey there, this is Dr. Joel Gould, and you're listening to my archive podcast called Get Your Smile On. This is a podcast that I recorded in 2015, and there's some really great information that I'm looking forward to updating with my new podcast called Revolution Radio. Stay tuned.
All right, everybody. Hello out there, and welcome to my international listening audience. This is Get Your Smile On, and I am Dr. Joel Gould, your wellness dentist, broadcasting live from beautiful Manhattan Beach, California, in the office of Modern American Dentistry. Tonight, as your wellness dentist, I've got an incredibly interesting story about something that you've heard about, a little something called vitamin D. Now, today I am calling my show Vitamin D for Dummies. And the reason is that vitamin D is not a vitamin. Now, when I got into the whole idea of wellness dentistry, I didn't really know that I'd be getting interested in nutrition and vitamins, and my whole foray into this whole industry of wellness is something that has been really exciting for me. And after 25 years of the practice of dentistry, not that I find teeth boring, but I really like the idea and always have of treating a whole person as a whole person. And the most important part of that is getting to know who that person is and learning about what their life is like and how we can make them feel happy and more comfortable. We've talked about a lot of different topics. Now, vitamin D, when I was in dental school, we learned about how important vitamin D was for healthy teeth and bones. I don't really remember learning a lot more about it than that. And since I have gotten into the understanding that vitamin D is not a vitamin, it is a hormone, it has really got my interest up. And the more I looked into this, the more fascinated I was by what's really going on in the medical industry and the lack of understanding and information of what vitamin D is. Now, when you need to get your vitamin D checked, you have to have a blood test. It takes a few days. And there's different methods that they can test, but we're going to talk tonight to one of the most interesting speakers on the subject of vitamin D, and we're just about to bring him on the phone. But I actually want to say that I'm really excited about this episode. We're doing this a little later today. This is 10 p.m. West Coast time because my guest is calling in from Ireland, and it is 6 a.m. there, and we want to thank him for getting up a little bit early. So today we're going to cover the really interesting things that you don't know about vitamin D. Now, what I find interesting is what I ask people, hey, have you had your vitamin D checked? Everyone says, oh, no, I take supplements, I'm good. And the most interesting part about that is people just being so dismissive about the idea that they could know that they're getting the right amount of vitamin D. What we're going to talk about is the mistakes that vitamin D has sort of had through history, and also the idea that the FDA, their recommendations for vitamin D is 800 international units. Now, we're going to talk about vitamin D doses in international units, and the reason we're going to do that is because the FDA and a lot of different medical professionals really haven't had the idea of how much you need and how do we regulate this. Well, I'm going to go ahead and bring on my guest tonight, and I want to welcome Ivor Cummins to my show. Ivor, are you there?
Hi there, Joel. Yeah, here I am.
How are you doing? We've got 10 p.m. on the West Coast, and I guess the sun's coming up in Ireland?
It is indeed, yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank you in advance for arranging this with me to be on the show, and I'm really excited. I know that you're a very technical speaker, and I've watched your presentations, and they're medically very fascinating. But today, with my show, I'm focusing on a sort of a broader audience that maybe isn't as well versed in the medical side, and I sort of want to focus on a lot about what how you came to be this sort of vitamin D expert. So, go ahead and I'd like my viewers to know your background and go tell us about yourself.
Right, Joel. Well, I'm a biochemical engineer originally, and I've worked for nearly 30 years now, mainly focusing on complex problem solving in the engineering sphere. So I've really specialized in leading teams to solve complex problems, follow the right methodology. And obviously this turned out very useful when I got into the medical world a couple of years back when I had my own health issues. So I was able to research hundreds of papers. I understand the statistics. I understand the biochemistry. And at one point I came across D quite early. So I was studying metabolic syndrome, atherosclerosis, heart disease, and metabolism, and carbohydrate and fat, which is kind of getting to be a big deal now, the low carbohydrate movement. But inevitably I came across vitamin D because it's profoundly connected to all of that and to so many things, as you've mentioned yourself.
Okay. Well, great. So I know that because this is a half-an-hour radio show, I want to get right to your information, but there's lots of different connected topics that are related to everything that you just said, and I want you to know that these are topics that I really am going to be covering in my future shows because, like you, I've had some health issues that are related to the things that I'm getting interested in discussing. So this is a very broad topic, and I've really asked you some difficult questions here, how to sort of summarize, how this works in vitamin D. So I'm going to let you do your thing, and we talked about humans and evolutions and all that, and I guess give me your best elevator pitch for how vitamin D came up in the world. And I don't know if they use that expression in Ireland, but that's pretty typical out here in Los Angeles.
Yeah, Joel. Well, I work in the corporate world, so yeah, we got that phrase. Okay, I'll try and simplify. So basically, in terms of human evolution, and there's lots of different views, but I'll go with the primary one. So several 100 million years ago, we left the seas, and in the sea, vertebrates, or animals with backbone, access calcium all around them. Whereas when we moved onto the land, you needed to get calcium through food and other forms and absorb it. So vitamin D became a critical part of that. So it enables the extraction of calcium and the absorption into the body to make bones and many other things. So very early on in our evolution, vitamin D became a very important part of our physiology. And as a result, I believe, it became importantly connected to many other control systems in the body because it came so early. And then for human evolution, around 20,000 years ago, maybe 30,000, we migrated northwards away from the high ultraviolet light environment of the equator. And that's where it's believed our skin coloration became increasingly white. And that was one of the key reasons was to access vitamin D from UV sunlight energy, because there's so much less UV as you move northwards from the equator. Really in America and Northern Europe, you've got a few months of the year where mainly in the midday period, when the sun is directly overhead, you access a lot of UV for vitamin D production. Because it's so important for the body, it's believed that our skin lightened in order to access a lot more in environments where there was a lot less UV. Now, they have done studies linking human skin color from indigenous local populations from all over the world, linking it to the available ultraviolet light, and seeing very powerful correlations. So the human skin color basically tracks with UV availability, thus ensuring that you'll get plenty of vitamin D production all around the world. And that's kind of really a snapshot of, how we've evolved to access this critical component.
Right. Okay. Well, so I know that a lot of people may not know, or I think that most people do understand that vitamin D, the precursor to the active form, is synthesized on our skin by sun exposure. Aside from that, where else would people get vitamin D if they weren't getting their sun exposure?
Well, if you're not getting the sun exposure, and it's been hypothesized that the Inuit, who are very far north with poor sun, they have access to a lot of fatty fish. So you can get vitamin D from organ meats, fatty fish, and a lot of foods that, to be quite honest, we don't eat a whole lot anymore. So not only does the modern population, are we sun-fearing because of the dermatology scares, which are, mostly invalid. We might get into that. But
Sure.
the population is also not eating vitamin D-rich foods anymore. So cod liver oil, organ meats, fatty fish from cold water areas, they're the other sources. And of course, to a certain extent in dairy products. But generally speaking, the American population now, if you take an evolutionary level of hydroxy D in the blood, that would have been the 40s. The average for the population is around 20, which is getting to the deficient level, and many, many people are below the deficient level.
Right. Okay, so I just want to clarify for our listeners. So we're talking about a number like 20 or 40, and that's nanograms per microliter. That's how that is tested in the body. So it's a test, standardized test?
That's a standardized test. There are other units, but the US units, nanograms per ml, are probably the best ones. We won't confuse people with the other unit systems.
Right.
An evolutionary level of this component in the body created from the vitamin D itself would be in the 40s, possibly in the 50s for women. But everyone is pretty much way below that now.
Right, okay, and that's something that's really more coming to light these days, which is great. But when I discuss this with my patients, a lot of times, everyone's very quick to say, "Oh no, I drink lots of milk," or "I take a multivitamin." And having you on the show, I wanted to make sure that everyone understands from an expert point of view, it doesn't really matter what you think you're getting. It's really about the level in your blood. Now, in some people don't. When you take a vitamin, it's different than when you have a hormone. So we're looking at a range, aren't we? We want to be at a certain range, and that range would sort of change. If you tested yourself every day, it wouldn't be the same. It would be a little bit variable. Yeah,
there will be variability in the test, but generally it's not a bad test. Even if you take a one-off reading, they've found that over time it doesn't change too much for people who have consistent behavior. But the range would be, the best range that I can come to advise people is around 40 to 50 would be the range. Now, there are some researchers who believe you should be higher. I'm not sure there's evidence to really back that up. And then the government, of course, seems to be happy with levels around in the 20s, which I would say the evidence would suggest is too low. So 40 to 50 would be a good range. And the beauty is you can get this simple test, and then over a period of 3 to 6 months, you can access sunlight, take supplements, and then get a test six months later, and just verify that you're generally on the right track.
Okay. Well, before we talk about what happens when you don't have enough vitamin D, I want to talk about vitamin D toxicity. How much vitamin D would somebody have to take to feel a toxic effect?
Okay, Joel, that's a great question. So the best data that I can, and I've researched a lot, that I can come to is if you take over 30,000 international units a day, right, of supplement, you're entering the area where you could go too high on vitamin D. So to give a reference for people, if you go out in healthy sunlight and you have a lot of your body exposed and maybe you become slightly pink, you will generate around 20,000 units in that day. So nature has provided us with the system through our skin that's able to produce 20,000 units in maybe half an hour or an hour. So that'll give you an idea of what's natural to produce in a day. So the current guidelines say 800, but to be honest, 4,000 or 5,000 a day has no chance of toxicity, and it's probably what you'll need if you're not accessing sunlight in order to get your blood levels up to good evolutionary levels. So let's just say up to 10,000 a day is certainly not toxic.
Okay. Well, 10,000 a day, if people were taking supplements, that would definitely be a lot. Now, much more interesting to my listeners, and really, when I was listening to your presentation, you talk about something called the smile curve. And boy, the smile curve should actually be a frown curve, shouldn't it?
Yeah, they're pretty impressive, and the smile curve just shows that the incidence of many, many diseases get higher as you move away from the equator. Now, there is an element that people away from the equator in more advanced societies, they obviously eat more bad food and all that kind of stuff. But it's a very strong relationship where when you move from the equator, you have less availability of ultraviolet light and you tend to produce a lot less vitamin D, particularly during the winter. And many, many diseases become worse in those areas. So multiple sclerosis, diabetes, got obesity and heart disease. And if people wanted to follow this up, there's a book called Cholesterol and the Sun by Dr. David Grimes, available on Amazon, etc. And it really goes into a lot of what we're talking today for the layperson. But yeah, they've even seen that the patterns, if you take France, the incidence of multiple sclerosis doesn't just follow the north to south like the smile curve. It actually follows the weather patterns and where there is less cloud cover and where there is more sun availability. So UV availability tracks with many, many diseases, and it's believed to be through the vitamin D effect.
Wow. Okay. Well, so I just want to clarify, when we talk about what a smile curve is, this is sort of more for a scientist who likes to plot things onto a graph. And if I got this straight, and if I'm explaining this properly, it is if you plot the diseases that we talked about, and it's pretty much almost every disease, when you plot this on a graph and you do it in relation to your distance away from the equator, when you look at that graph, it makes a sort of a smile shape along the X and Y axis for anybody who still remembers that from their junior high or algebra or geometry. This seems to be like something that everybody should know about. This isn't some groundbreaking discovery. These are somebody so scientists have taken just general data and they plotted it on a graph. And when did people start to know or see that there was this correlation between poor health and distance from or less availability of sunlight?
Yeah, Joel, I'd say decades ago, really, it's known, but I think the general established orthodox kind of medical community, as you said, there's not a lot of awareness. So although in scientific circles there's an awareness, it's not generally, publicized a lot. And I'm not sure why exactly. There are very strong correlations. Some would argue that they're only correlations and that can't prove cause. And I guess that's true to an extent. But because the correlations or associations are so strong in those curves, you really have to assume there's something going on there. Interestingly, if you go from north to south, even within countries, you see a shift in the disease. So it's not just across the world, it's also within countries and across Europe. From north to south, you see the same relationship. So it's very powerful, and it's kind of consistent wherever you go. It's very strong. The important thing is that there are also the mechanisms. So if something like that correlates or tracks, it may not prove cause. But for vitamin D, there is so much research showing how it can affect those diseases that if you put everything together, it's quite powerful.
Yeah, being sort of medically aware and having almost 30 years in. I was really shocked. I thought I had seen most of the mysteries of life exposed, but to see, this was one of those, hopefully my listeners are beginning to understand that this is really kind of a shocking revelation that all of modern medicine, and especially in a place like California where health and wellness is so highly valued, this is literally really still just not known. I had a patient in yesterday who is a medical doctor, and we talked a little bit about it, and he said he was very big on D, but we talked about he had absolutely no training, that there was really just no information out there, and if medical doctors don't know, then certainly the general public isn't going to know. Now, I know that I want to talk to you, as we get towards the end of this, I want to talk to you about what you're now working on, but I want to still focus on the vitamin D just because I know that you're sort of past this, and this is passé. You've been talking about this without kind of the recognition that it deserves, but I want to sort of put a more common sense version of this for my listeners so they can understand why a chronic vitamin D deficiency in America, how would that show up? And we talked about, or I sort of, we discussed back and forth about the idea of hibernation and winter and summer. And I know that it's not super technical to talk about this, but I think that it would really give our listeners an understanding if we could maybe discuss about, the move north of the border and what happens in spring with mammals versus winter. How would you sort of explain that to the average person who's not completely aware of the whole vitamin D story?
Well, yeah, the seasonal shifts, there's a lot of different theories, but again, diseases track seasonally. So when many diseases, including tuberculosis back in the day and heart disease, and to be honest, too many to mention, the incidence or the amount of them increases when people are at their low vitamin D level. So low vitamin D, again, is associated with excessive disease rates based on seasonal shifts. Now, you can store vitamin D, so if you access plenty in the summer, and you can store the vitamin in your fat, and it can kind of carry you through the winter. But there are strong beliefs emerging that maintaining a steady D intake during the whole year has a lot of benefits. So a lot of studies around that, and the best advice would be to keep your D level pretty consistent throughout.
Right. Okay. Well, it makes perfect sense once you sort of become aware of this. And one of the things that was also interesting to me is the idea that having an optimal level of vitamin D would allow your intestinal flora, or the bacteria in your intestines, to make different types of chemical products like B vitamins. Was that something that you were really looking into, or is that sort of not the focus of what you were considering?
Yeah, well, the whole gut health thing is really, really important. More my expertise on that front would be around carbohydrate, that excessive carbohydrate, and fructose can, pretty much give you the wrong gut macrobiota. But yeah, vitamin D, does partake in that also, but it's not something I'd have gone so deep into, more the mechanisms connecting to disease. So vitamin D has a lot of mechanisms in the body that really mimic what some drugs attempt to do. So just to your earlier question about the medical field, I think doctors are trained mainly in pharmaceutical intervention, recognize the disease and then give it the right drug. But I think if D is at a good level, it has the effect that a lot of drugs would have. So it enables processes to run much better, and you would not have as much need for the drug or treatment side. So I think the medical profession really is educated, not in nutrition or in the criticality of these vitamins, but more in identifying the problem and then applying the pharmaceutical.
Right. Well, that is welcome to America. And, what's funny about me is that as a wellness dentist, being in California, I'm also Canadian. And the Canadian healthcare system is very different than the U.S. healthcare system. And having lived in both countries, I really see the differences. Although in Canada, we do still have the same push to treat things with medications. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about the cancer connection here in two different ways. One is the idea that sun exposure causes cancer, and then the other is the vitamin D connection with regard to people's DNA. I think those are two kind of really shocking facts that were brought to light when I heard you speak. So, again, back to the elevator pitch. What's your best elevator pitch on what how cancer, DNA, and sun exposure fit together?
Yeah, so cancer is a really interesting one, and I think if I try and simplify it, there's been an idea for many decades now that the sun causes cancer. Keep out of the sun, less the better, which is obviously an absurd idea. We evolved with the sun. It creates D, it creates nitrous oxide, it expands your arterial, your blood vessels. There's a huge amount of beneficial effects from the sun. We evolved with it. But this idea for a few decades has been it causes cancer. Now, people mightn't be aware, there's only around 2,000 deaths a year from the classic simple skin cancers. They're very common, but there's very low mortality rate. You can treat them relatively easily. However, there's around 8,000 or 9,000 deaths a year from melanoma, which is the really nasty skin cancer. And the thing about melanoma is most good studies show that getting more sun exposure means you'll have a lower rate of melanoma. And the reason is that healthy sun exposure keeps your vitamin D high, and your skin protects itself by releasing melanin, and by tanning. So the irony is that more healthy sun exposure without burning actually links to lower rates of the serious skin cancer, the one with the high mortality, right? But unfortunately, the whole dermatology world for the last 40 years has non-stop driven this idea that sun causes cancer. And the earlier, and even a lot of sunblocks nowadays, they actually block the UVB, which creates vitamin D, and they allow through the UVA. Now, the UVA, there's a lot more UVA in the sun's energy, and it's the UVA in many studies that links more closely to cancer generation. So the funny thing is, people with sunblocks were losing their vitamin D, losing the benefits of UVB, while the sunblock was allowing through the UVA, which is more closely linked to cancer generation, the melanoma. So the whole sun and cancer thing has been, I think, completely mixed up. And as a result, people are staying away from healthy sun, evolutionary sun, and they're losing out on all the benefits. But it's pretty mixed up.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that when you start to come up against the American medical community, and that's such a strong belief to have that any sun exposure is dangerous. And what I like about the whole issue is that, I think about the pharmacy companies that are going to lose money if people were to have their optimum vitamin D level. A lot of medication use would go down. But I think those people should probably reinvest in the vacation and safe sun exposure industry. I think we could probably have a lot more fun with resorts where you go for your vitamin D than going to a hospital and getting some chemicals that are just basically putting a Band-Aid on what's a larger issue. It's pretty incredible. Thank you so much for how articulate you are in getting that message across. It's really great to hear. Now, before we sort of get to the end of the show, is there anything about vitamin D then in all your work and studies that really struck you that you want to sort of leave my listeners with so that they can understand a little bit more about this crazy topic?
Well, yeah, elevator pitch on that one. I guess keep in mind that, you make 20,000 units a day easily in a healthy sun exposure without burning. So that should give people an idea of what nature pretty much intended. So why would the body create 20,000 units in a day of something unless it had a reason? And therefore, taking a few thousand units a day while tracking your blood with a test occasionally can get you into that 40-plus evolutionary range. D level is connected to so many diseases, it's kind of bizarre in a sense, but it also, without getting into detail here, has detailed technical mechanisms as to why it would connect to those diseases. So it's not really a mystery. Without going into detail, there are many D actually enables you to go into your DNA and your very DNA to unwind it and create molecules that can help create enzymes to deal with infections and deal with other problems. So I think you mentioned earlier, Joel, if people realize their DNA is not just kind of sitting there or, enables you to procreate, your DNA is accessed all the time in your 40 trillion cells, and it is unwound, the two strands, and you encode off proteins and enzymes depending on what your body needs. So it's a living library, and vitamin D is intimately connected into accessing that library properly to access the code of our evolution for helping us with health problems and running your system. So it's really profound, and everyone should be around the evolutionary level, ideally, but over probably 3/4 or more are below the evolutionary level we would have had as humans thousands of years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just incredible. So, I know in America is sort of that's what we hear around the world. But is this known in a lot of other countries, or is it better known in other places, and most Americans are not knowing or ignoring it?
It's a worldwide problem, Joel, because a lot of the worldwide health communities kind of follow the US lead and the guidelines. So it's a worldwide problem. In the UK now, rickets is actually making a return. So from the Industrial Revolution, the 1800s, we had children with misformed bones from lack of sun exposure. It's actually coming back in the UK now after 20 or 30 years of bad science, I would say.
That's absolutely unbelievable. All right. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for going back into to the vitamin D world. But now I sort of want to talk to you about what you're working on now. I was following on your website, which we're going to give to our listeners at the end here. You have it's a little different focus. If you want to, you can maybe not another elevator pitch, but this is something that you're really into. I'd love you to explain to me and to my listeners what it is that you're working on.
Okay, so really what I've been working on the past while, I'm doing a book, and I'm funded by a philanthropist, and it's to explain, well, a couple of things. One is the calcium scan of the heart, the CT scan, which is very inexpensive, and it really tells you if you have heart disease in your arteries like no other technology. You get a CAC score, and that will basically show you can have someone who has high risk, and they can get a scan and find out that they have zero calcium in their arteries and they're actually in good shape. Or likewise, you could appear to be healthy and slim, like my sponsor, and find out that your arteries are in terrible shape and you've got advanced heart disease. So it's to get that message out there about this CT scan of the heart, and then also to explain how to avoid heart disease. And a lot of that is to do with the hormone insulin, and our modern population is suffering massively from high insulin, metabolic syndrome, middle obesity, and heart disease. And a lot of that relates to excessive carbohydrate driving up your insulin levels. But I can't go into detail here. So that's
Sure.
about.
Okay. As I read on your website, and I was sort of wondering, we have all these processed carbohydrates, and back 30,000 years ago, did our ancestors eat any carbohydrates that we would consider very healthy, that we want to definitely include in our diets?
Well, yeah, the carbohydrates, they would have seasonally had access in the northern hemisphere to, fruits. They would have been lower sugar fruits, though, and they would have only got them at certain times in the year, whereas now everyone's gorging on high sugar fruit all year round. That's a problem. They also would have accessed tubers and, underground tubers, but they would have been eating a lot of above ground vegetables, which are low in sugar and glucose. So they would have been eating carbohydrates, but far, far healthier than what we eat today. So once you process them, you take away a lot of the goodness, you're left with pure glucose sugar, and that sends your insulin crazy. So it's a massive problem nowadays where people's insulin levels are way, way above where they should be, and that promotes fat storage. It stops you healthily burning your own fat, and it basically drives a whole host of diseases. So insulin, I think, in the next decade is going to be the big story. They've underestimated the damage from high insulin for 50, 60 years at least.
Wow. Yeah. Well, so before we close the show, I guess that brings me to this is all a similar topic. Is that we have, the entire American medical industry is sort of running in a completely different direction than what you have been looking into. Do you see any hope? Are there messages getting out there? Do you see a little bit of a turn of the tide for America and for how we're viewing our health?
Yeah, I think it's beginning, Joel. So the 2016 dietary guidelines, a preview has been sent out, and they are dropping dietary cholesterol from the guidelines. It's no longer of concern, and I think this was known decades ago in around the world. They're also beginning to pull away from recommending low-fat diets, which, quite frankly, have been a disaster and have been a large part of the diabetes and obesity epidemic has been pushing higher carb, and they're realizing that now. So even the official authorities that have not moved for 20, 30 years, even though the scientific evidence shows they should have, are beginning to move. And I was just in South Africa in February, and the world's first low carbohydrate summit was on, and I was part of that. And we had 20 experts from all around the world, doctors, PhDs, specialists, speaking for 4 days on the perils of carbohydrate. It was a huge event, and people can look it up on the web. So I think the world is beginning to realize with the internet, with access to scientific papers like I was able to get through the internet, smart people around the world are beginning to realize, hold on a minute, they really mixed things up 50 years ago or 40 years ago when they pushed high-carb guidelines. And all that, I think, in the next 10 years is going to completely shift.
Well, I really hope so, and part of me doing the show is to actually help to push things in that direction. Some of my other shows that I have and will have covered are really a lot of preventive care talk. You know, in dentistry, preventive care saves thousands of dollars in pain and time in the chair, just the same way that preventive care of your body by eating and getting the right amount of, say, sun exposure can really decrease a lot of people's pain, agony, and suffering. So I want to let everybody know how they can get a hold of you. If you want to give out your website address, go ahead.
Oh, all right, thanks, Joel. It's www.thefatemperor.com, and that's EMPEROR. So
The Fat Emperor.
Yeah,
I love it. I love it. That's a great name. You know what? And I'd love to have you on a later show to speak about this. And I'd love to even know how you came up with that name. That sounds pretty incredible. I love the idea also that eating relatively healthy meat and cheese is back on the diet because they're pretty great.
Yeah, and your teeth. There's no better way to protect your teeth than to back off on that digestible carbohydrate.
Definitely. Hey, hold on. I've got to have some business. No, I'm in the promotion of health here, and there's no secret about how to get rid of tooth decay. But sure, it's funny how it all fits together. So I want to thank you so much for coming on my show. I really appreciate it. You are my first international guest, and I'd love to have you on the show again. Thank you.
For sure. Thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, great. Hopefully we'll speak to you soon. All right, everybody. I hope that if you're listening live, that kind of shocked you because, like I said, when I learned about this, I was really blown away. And there's so many interesting topics that this opens up. Health and wellness dentistry, absolutely. Vitamin D is a very interesting issue. And in future episodes, I want to talk about the link between vitamin D and sleep apnea and sleep and breathing disorders, and I've got some incredible guests who can maybe take us down that road. So that's it for tonight. I want to thank all of you for listening. I want to thank my incredible producer, and happy birthday, Maria Di Giovanni. You're the best. And until next time, get your smile on. I look forward to seeing you. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook, Modern American Dentistry, and fairly soon, hopefully, we'll have these podcasts posted on iTunes. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.